Welcome, everyone, to the November chapter meeting of the San Fernando Valley chapter of Climate Reality Project. We are so glad to have you all here this evening on this Veterans Day, where we honor the end of World War I on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, as well as all the veterans who have served before and since that moment. It's a big day. Lots going on in the world right now. COP30 going on. News is kind of all over the place. But we've got an expert here who I hope is going to give us some guidance about how to process what's going on and how to use our words wisely to help shape it as it goes forward. So before we begin, we always like to start with a land acknowledgement. And tonight's land acknowledgement will be read by one of our members, Maureen Kellen-Taylor. Maureen grew up in Guyana on the edge of the wilderness, which she credits for teaching her how she belongs to nature. And her PhD research focused on changing the prevailing worldview to be more ecocentric. She founded Climate Creatives, which became a national group, and her own artistic work has run the gamut from an art show called Plastic Does Not Belong Here, based on plastic she pulled out of local creeks, to an intergenerational mural of how Dallas could become more sustainable that's called Dallas Dreams for the Dallas chapter of CRP. She is dedicated and has spent more than 15 years working to undo ageism and encourage elders to develop their skills and passions. Something that, fits right in with the speakers we've had from Third Act this year. We really appreciate people who never stop caring, never stop working for a better future. With that said, Maureen, will you please give us our land acknowledgement for this evening?
A land acknowledgement is a formal statement that recognizes and respects Indigenous peoples as stewards of this land and of the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. It acknowledges the history that has brought us to reside on this land, the colonialism that is present in our current systems, and calls on us to be mindful of our own present participation in it. We acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Tongva, the Kish, Tataviam, and Chumash tribes.
Thank you so much, Maureen. That was wonderful. And because we do have people calling in from all over the country this evening, please feel free to put your ancestral lands in the chat as well so that we can acknowledge those as well. I myself am calling in from Woodland Hills in the San Fernando Valley, which is more on the Tongva Chumash side. But we know we've got people coming in from all over, so don't hesitate to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are calling from. Okay, I want to take a moment right now. If you read our newsletter, you have seen this news, but we lost a climate giant last month when Melanie Winter died after several years of struggling with cancer. Melanie was a huge inspiration to our chapter from the moment she first was one of our guest speakers at one of these meetings in August 2021 and told us all about the River Project, which is the organization that she founded in order to work for a better future for the LA River and all of the surrounding watersheds. And it was her work really that got us going with the Sepulveda Basin project to revitalize that section of the LA River, which wound up encouraging us to, help with the Sepulveda Basin Coalition of over 80 organizations that contributed to the vision plan for how the basin will be revitalized. She, it's hard to capture her in words. The photo that you see right there kind of sums up her fierceness, maybe. She was someone who never gave up and never stopped working toward a better future and never stopped pushing others to really believe in a vision of what she could see as, the future of LA and the LA River. She may not have lived long enough to see her dreams of a concrete-free LA River come true, but we know that her influence will be shaping that development of the Sepulveda Basin and other areas of the river over the coming decades. Um, there is an event coming up on November 22nd that is being hosted by the Neighborhood Council Sustainability Alliance. Michelle has put a link to that in the chat. If you would like to attend in her honor, it's going to be a wonderful event. They've got a great list of guest speakers. Ed Begley Jr. will be there, Nithya Raman, a whole bunch of, kind of high profile legislators who really want to recognize Melanie's influence. And even if you can't attend, they have opened up a fund that is going to support her ongoing work. It's going to keep the River Project website alive so that all the reports that she managed to get done are continue to be available. So if you would like to contribute in her honor, you can also contribute to that fund at the link in the chat. Without further ado, though, I would like to hear from our experts. So I am going to turn things over to Diana to introduce our guest speaker for tonight.
Thank you. We are very honored tonight to have Dr. Genivieve Guenther, who is a former Renaissance scholar who turned to climate research and activism and is now a leading expert on climate communication. Using her training in rhetoric and cultural politics, as well as social science research, she works to revamp the ways that we talk about the urgent need to phase out coal, oil, and methane. In 2018, Dr. Guenther founded End Climate Silence, a volunteer organization that pushes the news media to start talking about the climate crisis with the urgency it deserves. She directs strategy and outreach, helping journalists explain the links between global warming and extreme weather, and headlines the critical findings of climate science and their implications on all aspects of our life. So welcome, Dr. Guenther, and you guys should know she is actually on the East Coast and is joining us on a holiday, and she has a broken foot. So we so appreciate you being here tonight and look forward to hearing you talk. And then we have questions that we would love to follow up with. So take it away.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to join you tonight, Diana. It's great to be with you all. I'll speak very briefly about the research that I did for the book I published in 2024 called The Language of Climate Politics, Fossil Fuel Propaganda and How to Fight It. The book argued that rather than being polarized, as we all think of it, climate politics are actually quite unified around a particular false idea. And that idea is that we can keep using fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, and still somehow deal with climate change anyway, either because it's not going to be that bad, as Bill Gates suggested just a few weeks ago, or because there's going to be some sort of technological solution that will allow us to control or adapt to warming. Again, as Bill Gates suggested just a few weeks ago. And we all think of Bill Gates as being a kind of, climate leader, perhaps, or at least someone who embraces the knowledge that climate change, human-caused climate change, is actually real. But he is actually, for example, the most stark epitome of someone who is looked to as a climate leader, but is actually spreading what I identify as fossil fuel propaganda in my book. And so this fossil fuel propaganda is kind of like a story that underlies most of what the mainstream says about climate change, whether that's policymakers or journalists, sometimes scientists, and definitely economists. And that story goes something like this. Yes, climate change is real, but saying that it could possibly be very dangerous to humanity is just a form of alarmism. It's going to cost too much to phase out fossil fuels and to transition away to clean forms of energy and do the other things that we need to do to create a net zero emissions economy. The best thing that we can do is use fossil fuels to make poorer people wealthy, because economic growth itself is a kind of climate solution, because it allows us to bring to bear innovation on the problem and increase our resilience. So each chapter of my book takes one of the words in that story, alarmist, cost, growth, innovation, and resilience, and also adds another term, which is, in quotation marks, India and China, because for many years it was thought that, oh, we in the West really shouldn't bother to do anything about climate change because look, emissions are so high in China, so why should we try to reduce our emissions when they're just burning coal right and left? And now, finally, we all acknowledge that, in fact, China is the world's foremost developer and deployer of clean energy. They haven't quite started phasing out fossil fuels yet, but they're certainly way ahead of the United States in terms of how much clean energy they're developing. And indeed, also, as I talk about in my book in detail, how much climate policy they've actually passed in their government. So that is the book. And it was written during the Biden era. And it tried to show how what we think of as climate denial coming from the right actually has these resonances with kind of center-left ideology. And so it creates a kind of status quo, common sense, overlapping consensus that it's okay, we can keep using fossil fuels and still deal with climate change anyway. And we know that this is 100% not true. In 2023, the IPCC said that we already had too much fossil fuel, either already built and developed or in production at that time, to halt global heating at 2 degrees Celsius. So we already needed to phase out the fossil fuels that existed and somehow wind them back already in 2023. And here we are in 2025, and banks are still investing more in upstream production. Permits for liquid natural gas terminals are being issued right and left. Gas and coal power plants are being built next to AI data centers in order to try to supply the power needs of these huge, you know, warehouses filled with computer chips. So the kind of propaganda that I cover in the book is still very much in play. And of course, Donald Trump is outrageous, shocking, will go to the UN and say things like climate change is the biggest scam the world has ever seen. But his minions, such as Chris Wright, the Secretary of Energy, or even Doug Burgum, the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, will use the kind of rhetoric that I identify in my book to create the false belief that their attempts to crush clean energy and to promote fossil fuels are not actually a massive crime against humanity. So Chris Wright will say things like, well, yeah, sure, climate change is real, but it's just a side effect of the modern world. And that is a misrepresentation of it as something that's not that dangerous or is dangerous in a kind of just manageable way. So what I try to do in the book is show how the right wing uses these ideas, which are very often elucidated by mainstream economists, sometimes climate scientists who do not emotionally resonate with more dramatic or rhetorically exaggerated statements of activists, or how the right wing will sort of appropriate the language of adaptation and twist it in a way that makes it seem like adaptation is going to be possible, even though the research shows that adaptation in tipping points is virtually impossible because they so change the ecology in which our civilization is built. So I hope that you will all check out the book, because each chapter shows how these talking points are echoed by both the fossil fuel interests and the center right, which are center left rather, which themselves sometimes are fossil fuel interests. And then I suggest to you language that you can use in order to not only push back against this disinformation, but create new ideas and new emotions in the people that you talk to so that their support for phasing out fossil fuels goes up. And I have done polling on the messages I adumbrate in the book. And in general, support for for phasing out fossil fuels using these messages goes up by up to 10 points, which is actually quite a lot. I will say before I open the floor to questions that these messages were developed for a very particular audience. They were developed for people who are already concerned or even alarmed about climate change, but who do not realize that we actually do need to phase out fossil fuels and who don't necessarily support the phase out of fossil fuels, even though they feel concerned and alarmed about climate change. And that is actually a quite large constituency in the United States. So it sounds like a kind of niche audience, but to my mind, in fact, that's one of the most crucial audiences to activate in a way that gets them to push for the phase out of fossil fuels and not just sort of for climate action in general, because this sort of vague idea of climate action is in part what prevents us from honing in on the policies that we need to push our elected officials actually to pass and then implement. So there is a section at the end of the book where I talk a little bit about how to communicate on climate change and disinformation with people who are disengaged, curious, but not really too worried, because that takes a slightly different approach. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A if anyone's interested. And then my final piece of advice is if you encounter someone who is, outright spreading MAGA climate denial talking points, I would suggest that you not try to reason with them or change their minds unless you're in a kind of social setting where there are people watching you, who you need to communicate to through the conversation you're having with this climate denier. And so in those situations, I mean, depending on how this person is treating you and how they're approaching it, you could do very well with trying to be as compassionate and respectful as possible, even as you lay out the facts clearly, or depending on your audience and how condescending or aggressive this person would be, it's also possible to just sort of lay out the facts without trying to do any sort of emotional triage. But I leave that to your improvisational instincts. And I'm happy to sort of get into any details or talk about whatever you want to talk about. So thank you for having me again. And why don't we open the floor to questions for the next 30 minutes?
Sounds great. Thank you so much. That was really nice. And I just want to pull on a little thread because rarely do we hear Renaissance literature professor and fossil fuel in the same sentence. And that intrigues me. And I think for a lot of us, some of us can probably think back and maybe identify a pivotal point where we realized we needed to fight for climate change. And I think that's what brought a lot of us into climate reality. Curious if you experienced a pivot point like that, and then how that background shaped your approach to language and climate.
Yeah, I absolutely did. My pivot point was becoming a mother and starting to think about what the world might be like after I passed away. Because my son was born in 2010, so he's a teenager now. But, as I was reading climate science and reading the news about climate change, I kept seeing 2100, 2100, And so I was like, well, these decades where these massive changes, all of this destruction, all of this unraveling might possibly occur, that's his lifetime. That's not my lifetime. That's his, and it's not future generations either. It's my lifetime. and then his lifetime. So all of a sudden it became very, very, very personal to me. And also at first, I felt very passionately that the way climate change was being represented in the news media, the way it was being discussed by scientists, kind of contradicted every principle of rhetoric that I had studied in my literary career. And so I felt that I had a kind of knowledge about persuasion and desire that I could really bring to bear on this question. Because what's interesting about Renaissance literature, and I'll just say two things about it. The first thing that's interesting about Renaissance literature is that it's not it wasn't thought of as entertainment only. It was literature and poetry and the theater and painting, like what we broadly think of as the aesthetic, was kind of understood in the early modern period as a form of persuasion, but a form of persuasion that kind of almost worked like magic, that the emotions and the ideas and the experiences you would undergo by consuming these aesthetic objects, poems, paintings, stage plays, whatever, would actually kind of change your thinking and change your disposition and potentially kind of turn you into a better person, even if you hadn't really so chosen to be transformed in that way. So that is a really powerful, that is a sort of idea of literature as kind of a form of propaganda. And so I've always been studying theories of how language affects people's political dispositions from the beginning. This has always been my interest. This is what got me really excited about Renaissance literature. I mean, it was Shakespeare mostly in college. I just thought he was so incredible that I just felt like it would be such a lucky thing to be able to dedicate my life to studying him. But what I loved about it is this idea that by playing things, by pretending to do things, like you even see this in Hamlet, like by pretending, you kind of make it real. Again, it's a sort of like propagandistic idea of what representation does. And this is exactly what I'm doing now with respect to climate change. Like, I honestly didn't know how I was going to contribute to the climate fight. Like, one of the first things I did, I took some college courses in climate science on a platform called edX, which has college level courses. I did a lot of research into the climate communication just when I started getting like interested in this stuff. And then I did Vice President Gore's climate reality training. So I also have my green pin.
Oh, wonderful.
And I was honestly thinking about going back to graduate school and getting this degree called an MA in Climate and Society at Columbia at the Climate School. But at a certain point, I realized, no, wait a minute, actually, what I need to do, I don't need further training to come to this table and work on the communication and work on the disinformation, because in fact, I've been training for this since I went to graduate school in Renaissance literature. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I hope that,
Well, it's interesting and it's pertinent because for several reasons. I really like what you said. I mean, we all come to the table with a skill set, and I think perhaps rather than think about, we need to know more, learn more, study more about that, let's like bring through who we are, what we do into the space. So I really appreciated hearing you say that.
good.
You know, you're so good. I follow you, and if you guys don't, you should follow Blue Sky and other social media. But you are so quick to step in and respond. And you have such a clear perspective. And tonight you mentioned Bill Gates, and a few of us saw that there was a little webinar Sammy Roth held. How do we discern when language subtly guides us towards inaction? And that sort of feels like something that happens, and it can lull us into the state of, oh, well, it's not that bad. But you seem to be really on top of it and point out for our benefit, this is why that's not good. But just, is there a way that we can help do that for ourselves?
Let me first say that I also would very much love to be lulled I would very much like to exhale this sensation that I have had in my body since the election of like, oh God, it's very unpleasant. So I'm sympathetic um, to people resonating with language that seems to soothe our anxiety and to, you know, divert our attention to other things. But I think that you can always ask yourself, think of a piece of communication on climate as a kind of means to an end. And you can always ask yourself, what is the end to which this language points? Is this language trying to say that we don't need to get off fossil fuels as quickly as humanly possible? Then you know that it's a species of disinformation, that it's either hiding or misrepresenting something that climate science projects for the coming decades, or it's distorting the economics of both climate damages, which are going to be astronomical as they keep compounding in the coming decades if we don't phase out fossil fuels, or the economics of fixing this problem. So, you know, it's a tricky thing because there are assets that are going to need to be stranded, and those costs are going to fall mostly on the rich. But once we're on the other side of the transition, literally 90%, maybe more of the planet are going to be better off than they are now. So the thing to ask yourself is, what is this language trying to say to me? Is it trying to say that we don't need to phase out fossil fuels right now? And if the answer is yes, for whatever reason, and no matter what else they're saying about climate change, you know that that's disinformation. And you can try to identify whether they're misrepresenting something in the science, either by like ignoring it. That's a form of misrepresentation too, to ignore something, a reality, or whether they're distorting the economics of fossil fuel development, or whether they're trying to make you feel hopeless in some way or make you feel doomed, like there's no point in having this fight. So I think that's kind of the standard that I use for myself. And it's not even like something I do consciously at this point. Like, it's just because I've written this book and I've done so much research into this area, I can just look at something and see immediately that it's a form of fossil fuel propaganda or climate denial. This is what's tricky, because the new climate denial isn't actually denying that climate change is happening. It's not even always denying that it's caused by humans. It's just saying it won't be that bad, or we can fix it with some techno fix that we'll find out in the future. But basically, we can just continue on as we are, and we in the rich world will be fine, which is, aside from the moral horror of that statement, is also just simply not true. We in the rich world are not going to be fine if we don't phase out fossil fuels.
It's actually very helpful. I would like to ask you about COP30, but I'm going to table that for a second. Sharon, that maybe we can come back to it at the end, because I don't want to pull you off the discussion of your book. I'm going to go and pivot to Michelle, who has a question or two for you. Michelle, can I go ahead and add you?
Sure thing. Thanks so much, Diana, and thank you, Genevieve, for your book. I led our book club for the chapter, and I just found it to be so well researched and so brilliantly written. So I
Oh,
really
that's so kind
appreciate
of you. Thank you.
no, it's a wonderful book and very inspiring. So if you
Thank
haven't
you.
read it out there, please get your copy. But I just wanted to ask, in your book, you talked about how individuals who are involved with climate action can get their phrasing wrong or the framing wrong. And I was just wondering if you could provide any examples of phrasing that would help support the urgency that we need. So,
Yeah, so I mean, there's the thing that I try to do. And again, you don't want to use this technique with people who are disengaged with climate change. Like Thanksgiving is coming up. I'm I suspect there are probably people in your family who are very disengaged with climate change who you're going to be sitting at the table with. You don't want to try to scare them. They're going to shut down. This is not for them. This is for the people maybe who bring up climate change with you because they know that you're working on this problem and they're looking for someone to talk to, right? And so the structure of what you do, and I talk about this a little bit in the end of chapter 1. So the thing that you should do with these people is first you should listen and let people express their feelings about it and hold space, as they say, for those feelings, because very often people feel alone when they are worried about the climate crisis. I mean, there's a huge misapprehension in the United States that other people don't care about the problem. In fact, 89% of Americans want the federal government to do much more to achieve a net zero economy, but only 40% of Americans think that other people also feel that way. So there's this huge mismatch between the number of people who are concerned and alarmed about climate and the number of people who know that other people are also alarmed. So let people kind of connect with you by expressing their feelings, whatever they need to do. And then the structure of what you want to try to do is remind them that this will be incredibly destructive. Like pick something. If you guys are in California, so point back to the fires, remind people of that, but don't get stuck in these horrors. Don't get stuck in a place of looking at nature, looking at disasters, and getting stuck with fear. Try to steer the conversation immediately to the people who are blocking the solutions that we already have today, to the people who are selfishly just trying to line their own pockets and allowing our children's future to be threatened. Like pivot people's attention to our opponents, indeed our enemies, and try to convert a little bit of that fear into kind of an outrage and a desire to fight those people. It's a form of moral courage that you're trying to cultivate, right? So that's what I would suggest for people who come to you, and you can do it in an elevator pitch, right? If someone says, oh yeah, did you see that Trump said that climate change was the greatest scam ever? You can say, yeah, the greatest scam ever. Well, look what happened to Los Angeles last year. And I heard that there's a chance that Europe could turn into the Arctic in the next decades because a tipping point in the Atlantic climate is going to tip. Trump is the big scam. He's just projecting it out. And then you can list a couple of the horrible things. Did you know that they were trying to destroy the EPA? Did you know that they're suppressing climate science? Did you know that they didn't allocate the money that Congress like they are not dispersing the money that Congress allocated illegally? Like that's anti-constitutional. These people need to be taken out of office. And you're like, yeah. And that gives you the kind of juice to fight, right? So that's what I would recommend. Trying this 3-part approach, which is, you know, not letting people pretend that to themselves that it's not going to be bad, or acknowledging somebody's fear and giving them a sort of confirmation of that fear, but then immediately pivoting to this kind of like almost anger, but it's really moral outrage. And then the third part, which is also really important, if you can get there, is try to get people a little bit excited about what the world will look like after we do this, right? Or even not even after we do this, just try to get people excited about the solutions. Like everyone's electricity bills are going up right now because, well, for a variety of reasons. A huge part of it is already that we're paying the costs of rebuilding electricity and energy infrastructure after natural disasters. Honestly, that's a huge part of the costs. And that's only going to get worse if we don't halt global heating. But it's also that the fossil fuel companies are trying to build more liquid natural gas pipelines and terminals so that they can export this fossil fuel to other countries, which actually tightens demand in domestic markets. So costs are going up because of the causes and effects of climate change. And if we switch to clean energy, then basically our electricity becomes free. I mean, it's just the sunlight that we gather, and nobody can sell it to us once we have it in the grid or on our rooftops. And so, one thing that you want to end with is getting people excited about the world that we can build if we can get these maniacs out of power, or at least reduce their power enough that we can build the world that we want to have. So, it's fear, outrage, but then also desire for that new world.
Wow. I love that answer. That's amazing.
Thank you.
I'm actually going to pitch it over to Sharon to see if we have any questions in the chat.
Actually, we have a whole number of really fascinating questions. So keep entering them in the chat and we will get to as many as we can in the time allowed. But I want to start with this because it's specific and it's relevant. Kate is asking for some tailored advice on how to communicate if climate denialism is happening in a public meeting. So she gives the example that this is happening in her local city council meetings, both from city council members and from people making public comment. So in a public setting like that, where you have a limited amount of time to speak in a public comment, how do you address that?
I think that you need to come with numbers. I think that that is a great question. I think that you need to come with numbers. You need to quote scientific studies, and you need to remind people that there is a scientific consensus. 99% of scientists understand or acknowledge, have discovered that climate change is real and caused by human beings. And consensus doesn't mean they've like debated and come to an agreement. It means that independent lines of research have all come to this conclusion. So I think it's really important that you bring data and you bring numbers, so that, such as, the way temperature rise has correlated perfectly with carbon dioxide rise, like really get to the basic science, and that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is not being exhaled by plants. This is a specific kind of carbon dioxide that is released. It's a specific isotope that is released when you burn fossil fuels. So that you establish that there is a scientific basis for this, but then you also simultaneously, or at least at the end, need to speak from your heart, right? You need to say that this is not about science. This is about people and the places, the people that we love and the places that we love. And so to deny the science that we have is to harm so much of what we love. And so, we as community members need to band together to sort of protect X, Y, or Z, or to do this thing in order to protect our children. So you take the scientific data, you take the facts, but you say that this matters because it threatens the vulnerable people that we love and that we want to protect. So, and I would not, I would not even address, if it's possible, to not address the misinformation that these people are spouting or circulating. I mean, that also a little bit depends on how relevant it is to the questions that are being asked in these community meetings. So it's hard to give a sort of blanket recommendation. But again, usually if what you're trying to do is win the hearts and minds of the people who are listening to this, not get any climate denier to retract what they're saying. So the most important thing to do is to bring facts, show that you know stuff so that you're trustworthy, but then also speak from the heart so that people who, of course, love things too can identify with you, if that makes sense. Establish your credentials as someone who knows what they're talking about, but then offer yourself as someone that they can identify with because you are only doing this because you're trying to protect the things that you love. That's how I would try to manage that kind of situation.
That's a brilliant, dual strategy. And I'm finding that one of the, really cross aisle things right now is protecting public lands,
Well,
right?
there you
Because
go.
everyone can get behind that,
There you go.
regardless of, what perspective they're coming from. We all love our national parks.
Exactly.
There's a related question here that I'd like to follow up with
Yeah.
from Kristen, who says that she engages with deniers so that their followers can see actual facts, which is a public service we all appreciate you doing. And she says she's good at explaining the science, but now there are a lot of deniers who are just purely anti-intellectual, saying that scientists are corrupt. And it's hard to know what to say to that. And I feel that too, as a scientist, that, the lack of confidence or belief that science or truth exists at all is harder to combat than someone saying, oh, that particular fact is wrong.
Well, it's interesting, but I think this claim that people have decided that scientists are untrustworthy is itself a form of propaganda, because what's happened is a lot of the people who are in power now are claiming that scientists are untrustworthy, and then a lot of the social media algorithms, such as, the one on X, and to some degree, some of them on Facebook, are amplifying people who claim that scientists are corrupt. So it seems like a kind of consensus thing that's emerging in public discourse, but the research actually shows that the vast majority of Americans still trust scientists and that they're considered some of the most trustworthy public communicators in America still to this day. So I would just I just would urge us all on this call to assume that the majority, not the, Maha right, and not maybe the like yoga left, who are sometimes in this weird Venn diagram with the Maha right. I don't really understand that whole ecosystem. But the vast majority of Americans, even though vaccination rates are going down, the vast majority of Americans still trust scientists. So I would just work from there, and you're certainly not going to persuade anybody. I mean, if someone decides that scientists are not trustworthy, they're not deciding that because they've looked into the facts and they've changed their mind for reasonable reasons. They're doing that because this is what their social milieu is signaling them to do, right? Or they've read something really exciting on social media that sort of changed their mind without them thinking through the implications of it. And so nothing you're going to say is going to be able to address that because they've changed their minds for reasons that are unreasonable. So don't bother dealing with those people and just continue to perform what you know for the people who are reading these posts on social media and maybe not engaging. So, it can be very dispiriting on X, sometimes because it seems like, the worst right wing disinformation is what gets engagement, or the worst center left nonsense is what gets engagement. But I know for a fact that posts are still getting read by people who are making decisions. So just keep on doing what you're doing. And, try to don't focus on things you can't control, or else we're all going to just, it's just going to be too much.
Just lose our
So,
minds.
yeah, exactly.
So, we're talking about social media posts here,
Mm-hmm.
but what I really want to know is, for a group like ours that is just community members,
Mm-hmm.
what is the best avenue or the best avenues for us to reach people in a way that, gets the people who care but don't know what to do to start acting? So is
Mm-hmm.
it social media? Is it, writing letters to the editor that people would see in a newspaper? Is it, just going to community events and having one-on-one conversations, or actually knocking on doors? Like, what is our best mode of communication here to get these people to start acting?
Can I just say yes to all of that?
Yes, but I only have a limited number of hours per day.
Well,
Where
you
should
got to
we
do, okay,
focus?
so then you need to do the thing, since we need it all, you as an individual need to do the thing that feels the easiest to you, right? That is most naturally integrated in whatever you're already doing in your life. If you like talking to people in person, then you should be knocking on doors. If you like social media posts, that's what you should be doing. But so I think that the point is that climate change is not like a niche issue. It's essentially the effect of everything that we do in our society and in our economy. So that means that it needs to be talked about everywhere, in every milieu, in every form. So I think you need to just decide what feels the most natural to you, and what, because you don't want to fight yourself too much, because there's plenty of other things to fight. So if you like social media, do that. If you like knocking on doors, do that. If you like trying to pass out flyers at the supermarket on a Saturday, do that. But what I will say is, no matter what it is that you're doing to try to get people engaged, what I would recommend that you tell people to do is call their elected officials. Call them. Call their Call your local officials, call your state officials, call your federal officials, your your congressional representative, and your 2 senators regularly, every 2 weeks, and leave a message on their voicemail. Tell their staffers, if the staffer answers the phone, that you are very concerned about climate change. The United States is going down the wrong path, and that you want them to prioritize this issue, even with everything else going on. It doesn't matter whether that sounds realistic or not realistic. They need to be hearing that from us, because they are hearing that people don't care about climate change. They are hearing that climate change is a losing electoral issue. They are hearing that there are other things that we need to do. They are hearing that we should be backpedaling from the climate policy that was passed in the Biden administration, as if that was why the Democrats lost the election, when it totally wasn't. So, but even if we weren't in this particular historical moment in the United States, this is always what you need to do. You need to put pressure on your elected officials to pass the kind of climate policy that will actually phase out fossil fuels. That's it. I don't care how many flights you take. I don't care how many steaks you eat. I don't care. Yeah, that is secondary. What you need to do is talk about climate change in whatever venue feels the most natural to you, as much as you possibly can. Reassure people that they are not alone in being worried about this issue. And get everybody to call their elected officials all the time. That's it. That's what people need to be doing. So,
Yes. And it feels like calling into a void, but that doesn't mean that we can
it's
stop.
not. I swear to God, it's not. Even if if no one ever picks up the phone and you just leave voicemails for the rest of your life, those voicemails get tallied. they get discussed, they matter. They really, really, really do. And people don't realize that. I think that's part of the reason that civic engagement has fallen off so much, because people don't realize that actually this stuff matters. Because what are they going to, what are they going to do? Like, how would you ever get that feedback? But I promise it matters. So.
Okay, so there are two questions in the chat that I'm kind of going to fold together here because I think they're related.
Okay, but also it is 11 o'clock here, so I'm gonna actually only take one more question. So please do fold those two
Okay,
things
this
into
is going to be
chat.
the last question, everybody. We
Okay.
have kept Genevieve up past her bedtime.
Okay.
Last question. So one is about that, the media and our culture sort of limits our ability to actually imagine the results of climate change in a realistic way. So,
Correct.
which makes the changes we need to make seem unnecessary. So how do we kind of break through that to make people understand the urgency? But at the same time, do you feel like installing hope and optimism or worry and panic is like more motivating because you run the risk of climate doomism, right? If you show things that are too scary about our possible future. So how do you strike that balance?
Okay, well, I'll start with the doomism question. So yes, climate can feel extremely frightening and overwhelming. Again, I think that if you're talking to someone who already is engaged, I mean, you don't have to scare them more if they're already scared. But I think it's really important that people be scared, because we're not going to make this absolutely unprecedented, enormous change of phasing fossil fuels out of the global economy unless we feel like if we don't, we're going to be up shit's creek. Like, it's just not going to happen, right? But you don't want to be paralyzed. So that's the three-part structure I was talking about earlier, which is you need the fear, but you also need the moral outrage, the anger, and you need the desire for a new world. And that desire is not hope, because hope is passive. Hope is about, I mean, it's slightly a semantic issue. Like, very often when climate communicators want to instill hope in people, they start talking about solar panels or the technological solutions that we already have. And we already have those solutions, and they're not being implemented because there are powerful forces trying to obstruct, trying to prevent us from halting climate change, right? So hope is not about hope is not about knowing that this is possible, um, because the question is knowing what is possible. So to go back to the doom thing, the research that I knew I needed to talk about doom when I was talking about the question of alarm and alarmism and how that got used as propaganda, because very often scientists themselves don't want to talk about the more dangerous aspects of climate change, or use emotional language, and they justify this because they say they don't want to inspire doomism in people. But the number of actual doomers in the United States is very low. It's sort of like, at the most, 13% of Americans think that it's too late to stave off the worst effects of climate change. So the number of true doomers in America are very low. Unfortunately, a lot of young people feel a lot of despair around this. But again, it's not because the science is scary and people are scared of climate change. People are doomers because they look at the politics of climate change. They look at the politics of the United States, and they feel like the politics are inadequate to solving the climate crisis. So what you need to do is find a way to make people feel like they want to take this on because it's the right thing to do, whether no matter what our politics may look like right now, or no matter what the science is saying will happen if we don't phase out fossil fuels in the next 10 or 15 years. Like, all of that is over here, but really people feel despair because they feel despair over how little progress is being made, and how powerful the forces of obstruction really are. And so the most important thing to do is to sort of suspend that conversation in some sense about whether this is possible, what we're fighting against, whether we have the technological solutions or not, and just turn this into something that fighting against gives your life meaning. Like in the end, it's between you and your conscience and you and your soul. And so when you look back on the arc of your life, do you want to be someone who showed that humanity, you know, can be motivated by love, or do you want to be one of those people who allowed the people who are motivated by greed to win? Like, I don't want to be one of those people. So in some sense, that is at the end of the day, especially in a moment like right now that feels so overwhelmingly bleak with the Trump regime in power, you really can only keep going if you're doing this because you feel like it makes you the person, more like the person you might want to be. So I think this fear versus hope thing is a kind of misframing of what people are really struggling with when they confront the climate crisis. There's no way to think about climate change without getting scared. If you're thinking about climate change without getting scared, you're not thinking about it accurately, right? And the question of whether there's hope or not, it's like you don't want to leave someone with the sense of, oh, we have plenty of solar panels. China's going to fix it. It's fine, because that actually encourages passivity. Again, what you want is to say, like, at the end of the day, it's not even about what we can't look at what we can't control. Let's put it that way. The only thing that we can do is take as much action as we possibly can, because that is what allows us to, you know, confront our souls and feel good about it. To get a little maybe over dramatic, but there it
Or
is.
look our 15-year-olds in the eyes and tell them we're doing our best.
Exactly. Exactly. Like, I want, like, the last thing I say in my acknowledgments to my book is that, you know, I thank my husband, and then I dedicate the book to my son, and I say, you know, no matter what ends up happening, I want him to know that his mother tried. And I feel like that, and you know, that how else are you going to keep going in a moment like this? But again, you also have to sort of cultivate uncertainty. I don't know what's going to happen in 5 years. I don't know what's going to happen next year. I don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. So you have to you have to cultivate this state of not knowing and of uncertainty and leaving possibilities open, which I guess is a kind of form of hope. But just do this because that, in the end, it's, you know, it's you and your soul, and that's the person, that's what it comes down to in the end.
Genevieve, thank you so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate you staying up so late to do this for us West Coasters. At this moment, I would like to invite everyone to briefly unmute and give our speaker a giant round of applause and thank you for being here.
Thank you so
Wonderful
much.
evening.
Thank you.
So insightful.
That was great. It was
Terrific.
wonderful. Very hopeful.
Oh, yay! I'm so
Motivating.
glad
I think
to
we're
hear it.
all feeling kind of fired up.
Yay!
Great that
That's
you're a
wonderful.
climate reality leader. That's terrific. So,
All right. Well, thank you all so much for having me. It was really a joy to be with you all, and I'm so happy to be in this fight with you. And I hope we all can stay in touch. And onward. We got this.
And yes, if you guys want more, the book is great. Pick up a copy.
Aw.
It's short, it's succinct, like each chapter kind of explains one term and then, you know, what you can do instead. It's really useful. And also just, you know, follow her on Blue Sky or other social media. You'll get your daily dose of Genivieve Guenther, and it'll keep the ideas flowing.
thank you.
Thank you,
Take care of
Sharon.
your
Thank
foot.
you,
Thank you
Diana.
so much.
Good night, everybody. Be
Good
well.
night.
Right.
Thank you.